So in this lesson, we're going to be covering our McCalls 7279 pattern. And in this lesson, I'm going to just show you guys how to read a pattern envelope, mark your patterns, and cut it into your muslin mock-up. And the reason why patterns are so great for someone who's just starting out pattern making and pattern designing is all the measurements are pretty much laid out for you, and the guesswork of having to figure out what size something should be is mostly for the majority taken out, and you can just really focus on construction and reading the notes on the pattern in order to assemble the pattern. So let's get started. So first we have the McCalls 7279 pattern. We have our scissors, tracing wheel, seam gauge, our carbon or wax paper, water soluble pen, disappearing ink, marking pencil, and a rotary cutter, magnetic wrist strap that I'm going to keep my pins on, and just my needle. And then I have my rulers, my hip, grid, and French curve, and that's just in case I need to make any adjustments to my pattern. Just a regular marker. And if I didn't mention it before, some pattern weights, again, something that I also purchased. If we're talking about time and efficiency, pattern weights are a lot easier to remove than meticulously putting patterns, but sometimes it depends on the fabric. I'll add a little bit of both. So this is what we need to just sort of get started into creating this pattern. So now let's read our pattern. So when we're going into a store and we're looking for a pattern that we want to create, there's a couple of things that we have to look at before we go ahead and we cut our fabric. So first, the first view on the envelope you're going to see is what the pattern is and the number of the pattern. You're also going to see a couple of different views that you're going to have the option of recreating. So for the sake of this lesson, we're going to be focusing on view A. So once we decide what view we're going to do, we need to go ahead and read the top of the pattern to get our measurements. So at the very top of the pattern, I'll just hold it this way so you guys can see it. So first we're going to see the bust, waist, and hip measurements. And these are the measurements that you're going to use as a guide to let you know what size pattern that you're going to get. So for the sake of this lesson, I'm going to be using the size 8. So based on that, I'm going to go to the side of my pattern and say, okay, I picked size 8. Okay, this pattern has a size 8 in it. It's good to go. Why that's important is because sometimes the patterns, what you see here, doesn't register here, which means that this pattern either is not the right size or you need to find one that actually goes up to that size. But because this is a basic pattern block, then that's why it has from size 6 to 22. Normally, you only get a couple of sizes within each pattern. For example, if you do see one that you like and you don't see that size at all, you may want to go with a similar pattern and just modify it, or see if you can find that pattern in your size. I've had many instances where I brought the pattern home in a rush or in haste, got home and realized that is not the size pattern I wanted. And if it's severely off, there's not much grading or sizing up a pattern that you can do, and it might not even be worth it because then you run into so many other issues trying to grade the pattern. So you always want to make sure you read this measurement portion and then make sure it coincides with this side portion right here. So once you realize, okay, these match, I have a size 8 here, and they match these measurements for the most part. These are not going to be exact, but for the most part, they match. And in regards to the measurements, again, you don't want to just assume because you wear a size 8 in a particular store that this is going to be the right pattern for you. That's why we said in the body measurements exercise, either go to a professional tailor or have someone help you get accurate measurements before you go in to get a pattern for yourself or for a potential client that you're going to be working with. So now once we decided that, we're going to go to the back of the pattern. And in the back of the pattern, it gives you a lot of helpful things that are going to help you create this pattern and not waste a lot of time and energy, and especially fabric. So once we establish that we have the size, we're now going to go to some suggested fabrics. And what's great about this is if you're not sure what fabrics you should use for the dress, this is a great assistant. I mean, you don't have to go with these fabrics, but sometimes for example, if the pattern requires a stretch and you get a non-stretch fabric, it's not going to fit properly because the pattern was designed for a stretch material. So you want to make sure that you at least consider some of the pattern recommendations. It also says it's designed for medium weight to woven fabric. So these are just things you want to keep in the back of your head if you decide not to go with any of the suggestions, which here are wool crepe, wool blends, gabardine, and sateen. So the next one you're going to go to is size as it corresponds with the width of the fabric. So these right here, it's going to show you the view. It's right here. And here is the width of the fabric. So for our view A, it's saying that if you use a fabric with the width of 45 inches, you're only going to need 2 1/8 yards. If you're using a fabric with 60 width inches, then you're going to need 1 yard and 5/8. So what's the difference? Well, this width says you're going to get a narrower piece of fabric, and this one says you're going to get a wider piece of fabric. So you're obviously going to have a little bit more space. I always like to just round up. So if this says 1 5/8, I usually just get 2. If this says 2 1/8, I always just get 3. I find that in most patterns, they even with these measurements, they're still a little bit generous, but I just like to do that for my own sanity, so I'm not running back and forth to the fabric store because I ran out of fabric. And I also give myself room for error. So even though I've been sewing for quite a while, you still want to always give yourself room for error. You have the old adage that I said previously in the tools, not the tools portion, the body measurement portion, where you want to measure twice, cut once. And if you happen to cut and have messed up, at least you have excess fabric for yourself. So now we have our yard. So right here just tells you this is being measured in yards. And that's important too, because you want to know how many yards you need to get for the particular fabric. We talked about fusibles in textiles, and fusibles we said are that supporting fabric that often has like a sticky adhesive to the back where you're supposed to iron onto the fabric. So this basically tells you for our view A, we're going to need a fusible, and it tells you the width as well. It also tells you how much yards you need. So for this, you only need half a yard, but I would get a yard. So now that we've established that, we go all the way down here where it says finished garment measurements. And this just basically tells you when the garment is done and it's all put together. I would say in the muslin stage, which is the best place to sort of check for error, these are some of the measurements you can look forward to as to how everything should measure out. So it says that if you picked any style between A, B, or C, your bust line should be this, hip line, with lower edge. And this is just sort of like back checking and making sure, okay, am I going in the right direction? Are things looking the way I want them to look based on these measurements? I don't use them that often because if it doesn't fit, I'm gonna know. But if this assists you, if this is helpful to you, I definitely say definitely follow this. Okay, so again, I just circled that I'm gonna be using view A, and this is important to circle it. Why? Because when you're as you can see, when I open the pattern, there's gonna be a lot of lines, a lot of craziness that's gonna be very intimidating to you, especially if you've never actually seen a pattern laid out. And you wanna make sure that your eyes are always targeting A. Anytime you're cutting, you say, okay, I'm doing view A. I need to look for all the pieces that go to view A. Okay, and I also just did this little slash mark because we are doing 3/4 sleeves. We're not doing full length sleeves. That should be also something you sort of note, that way you don't cut all the way to the bottom and then realize, now I have to go back and adjust. So now that we know how to read our pattern, we are going to go. So when you first open up our pattern after you've taken it out of the envelope, you're going to open it up and see that the pattern comes with a series of instructions. If you get a little bit confused as to what order it goes in, it tells you up here in this corner the page, how many pages are included all together, and it has that at the top of all of them. That way you can keep track of what order the pages go in. So these instructions are pretty detailed, and it gives you a lot of information that you can use to put together your pattern, the fitting process, and also identifying different markings. So again, we have the view in this box here. And again, we chose view A, so that's where we're going to be focusing. Here it tells you how many pattern pieces there are in all to create your dress pattern. It shows you 1 is the front bodice, 2 is the back, 3 is the skirt front and back. It shows the collar, facings, and those are those supporting details that finish out a garment. We have our sleeves, armhole facings, and these just let you know the 10 basic patterns that are going to complete your construction, especially if you're going to go ahead and put a collar. So that's why you see the collar. So this just basically lets you know these are the pieces that you're going to be focusing on. In order to put your dress together, you're going to need about 10 pieces, give or take. Here are also some assistance. They give you some videos that you can use to just sort of help you along the method for the tissue fitting. This is an actual more detailed layout of the pattern. Here it tells you how to take some accurate measurements, altering a pattern, and just some more tips. It also covers darts and how to identify the wrong side and the right side. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because this is going to help you put together the pattern. So anytime, not just for this pattern, you're fortunate enough, you're gonna have actual live person demonstration for the pattern, but that's not always going to be the case. So when you're going to run into any issues as far as how to assemble the pattern, you want to be able to use these envelopes that are going to tell you and assist you with some of the issues you might run into and how to assemble the garment. So you want to make sure you're also keeping these in order, because if it's out of order, you're going to put the dress together out of order. And when you're sewing together a pattern or any garment, you have to stay in order. If you skip a step, you're going to run into issues where you're going to have to seam rip and take things out, and you don't want to do that. You want to go in the steps. So on this side here, it shows you how to identify some of the markings. As you're going through your pattern, there are going to be little legends or little notes that show you, okay, this is going to tell you the grain line, like we covered in textiles, placing things on the fold, buttonhole markings, and that's going to be the slit that you place the button through, and this is going to be where you're going to place the actual button. Notches and other kinds of symbols. This little circle with the cross inside of it indicates the bust line, so it just tells you all those things. It tells you how to make adjustments, adding length or shortening, and also how to mark and cut the fabrics. So if after this video you still want to sort of review and including the notes, this also sort of gives you reference when you're doing other patterns. Here we have the layouts, and this is going to tell you how to lay out your pattern. So here we're going to focus on the view A because we're doing dress A, and it's saying, okay, if your width of your fabric is 45, this is how you should lay it out to make sure you get all those pieces in, and it tells you the selvage and all those other areas. So basically lets you know how to lay out the pattern to maximize using that pattern. These indicate what side your pattern should, what side the fabric should be facing for your pattern. So right side, wrong side, and it lets you know, and that's important too, because if you cut twice on the wrong side, you may end up with two of the exact same patterns. If you need a left and a right, you might end up with two rights. So this is very important, or you might end up with a pattern with the main side facing up, and then instead of the main side facing up on the other side, the main side is facing on the wrong side. So that's why it's important to make sure that you're reading these directions for wrong side, right side. Okay. It covers here seam allowances and the different kinds of notches. We'll cover here, but notches are important because it allows you to indicate the front of a garment, the back of the garment, the side seams that you're kind of connecting, and a good indication to know that your garment is going in the right direction is when those notches match up. So for example, if you are putting together two side seams and you can't find those notches and they're not adding up, that either means you're not putting together a side seam or there's something off, and it's going to probably affect the waist or the hem of the dress. So if your if your notches and these little things that sort of poke out on the sides, if these match up, then that means you're going in the right direction. So all these things are important when marking the fabric. This envelope also gives you suggestions on stitching and how to put it in the zipper and all those kinds of things. So again, with this pattern, you have someone that's going to walk through the live instruction, but for future patterns that you're going to use, this is going to be pretty vital until you're comfortable with putting garments together without having to use the instructions. And I'm confident that if you practice, you will get to the point where you don't even need these envelopes, hardly any, to put together your garment. So now that we know what's inside the envelope and how we put together or read the instructions inside, we can kind of put this to the side. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.